We were just hearing about concerns regarding racial disparities in access to important transportation upgrades and that the impact of that on health disparities that are systemically manifested in the population. Our third project is about archival justice for Black Baltimore. Did you ever ask yourself how the curators of historical and museum archives decide who it is who has the opportunity to say through their exhibits, we were here, this is what we did, this is what we went through, this is how we looked, this is how we felt, we were here, we are here. Not everyone gets to do that. Like many other things in our society, choices about who is seen and heard in archives are influenced by systemic problems of justice. So this team brings together expertise in museum programs, Africana studies, and history to address issues of archival justice, specifically for Black people in Baltimore, with special attention to African American staff and contract workers at our own institution, Johns Hopkins University. And congratulations.
Yes, Hopkins is located in the middle of Baltimore City. So people of color will be coming through here. My only hope is that they're treated fairly, that there's equity, that there's opportunity here for them.
I would say that for now, I want there to be an impact, like a measurable impact on, culture and climate. Like, I feel like it's hard to measure, but I do want there to be a shift. Like, people from underrepresented groups feel like they belong.
Housing Our Story Towards Archival Justice for Black Baltimore is a project to record and preserve the stories of Black staff and contract workers at Johns Hopkins. And I'm very proud to say that by the end of this project year, Housing Our Story will have grown the number of African American voices represented in our university archives. I'm Jennifer Kingsley, and I'm here with my co-PI, Professor Shani Mott from Africana Studies. We're going to be tag teaming this presentation. Our third principal investigator, Professor Nathan Connolly, unfortunately had a commitment out of town, but maybe we'll be able to hear from him a bit later. We work with 3 undergraduate student investigators, Will Kirsch, Jendai Dickerson, Kiana Beckman. And starting this fall, we've also been involving in the project our classes in history, in Africana studies, and in museums and society. By engaging in the practice of creating an archive, Housing Our Story charts an ethical space that is largely absent from how we traditionally educate students in the humanities, where ethics tend to begin and end with reproducing on our syllabi the university's statement on academic integrity. This ethical space has 4 important dimensions, 4 significant dimensions. One is cultural, and that's where most of our archiving projects focus, including at the beginning at least, our own Housing Our Story. The cultural dimension, so just to define my terms a little bit, the cultural dimension typically involves adding marginalized voices to the archive or reading the archive in ways that push back against the cultural dominance of certain groups. Bringing out hidden stories, these kinds of efforts. Over the course of the project, however, 3 other dimensions have really grown in importance, and we're going to be talking in large part about these today. One is the social, aspects of connectedness, of belonging, relationships. The second is the political, aspects of representation and power. And the third is the economic, financial aspects and access to resources. Because whereas the Academy tends to treat the archive as a relatively benign and neutral space, what could be threatening about documents in neat boxes stacked on shelves? What Housing Our Story teaches us is actually that archives are dangerous. Housing Our Story asks people to share their lives and make them available to public scrutiny. And as our students have come to understand, this is risky business. And the risks are not limited to cultural misrecognition or cultural appropriation.
It's very difficult for someone to talk about their job here
staff we contacted for interviews expressed concerns about the political or economic repercussions of participating in our project. And this even when given the choice of limiting access to their interview or putting an embargo on it. So here I'm showing you two statements from workers who occupy quite different positions in the university hierarchy. But as you can see, they're expressing a related fear. And I would add to that some categories of staff are even prohibited by the terms of their contract from ever participating in any research interviews. It's an important element. If one kind of archiving danger involves risks to participants, we would argue that the other kind involves our own institutions, our social institutions. Because archiving people's experiences affects how we as a society narrate social problems. The stories we've been recording resonate with repeating themes. Stories upon stories that describe marginalization in the same terms, disrespect, or being subject to surveillance and policing. Collectively, the stories magnify each other, and they give evidentiary weight to aspects of social exclusion that aren't always transparent in the documentary record or in statistical data. And archiving might even create a moral obligation to act. Paraphrasing a participant who's worked at Johns Hopkins for over 20 years, if you don't know, you don't have to change.
As there are dangers in archiving, there is also potential power. It is a power that is born of new relationships, new ways of seeing or thinking of oneself within and in connection to the university. When I comb through the oral histories of workers who have worked at Hopkins for as few as 5 years, or as many as 40, there's one particular narrative trope that makes its way into the story, and it is one's care for students. Again and again, a number of staff members and contract workers spoke of themselves as caretakers. They talk about how much the students meant to them and the joy that they felt in being able to help students through the university. As one employee shared, the students are who make it worth it. On the surface, I have to say we love this idea, right? The sentiment gives us a very warm and fuzzy feeling. While such an utterance on its own might illustrate a certain love that one has for students, when it comes up again, or comes up again and again, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, it becomes a socially significant and a site of analysis. I noticed that for those staff who felt a general dissatisfaction with their job, often ended their narratives on this positive note, a note of care, a note of love. Such compulsive utterances, though, opens the door to fresh ethical questions. How does the relationship between students and staff actually help to protect a worker's precarious position? When students speak of their friendship with workers, does it offer them an existential safety? Does it become a way for them to stand outside the field of power that so clearly exploits the labor of those whose presence, as one student confessed, he had taken for granted? When we asked students what they were most excited about in doing this project, some spoke to the potential to connect with employees beyond the daily routine of hello and goodbye. They wanted to hear more about their stories and how their stories connected to the past. Some talked about helping people, and they believed that staff wouldn't have any other way to make their stories meaningful but through this process. If we consider here just for a moment the language that students use to talk about the process, it is important to note that they positioned themselves as conduit. Students saw themselves as the means by which a worker's story would be made known. But it was only through our facilitation of this process that students became more aware of themselves, but also became more than story conduit or collector. They became interpreters of narrative, investigators of their own historical moment and their place in it. They began to question the university's story. We instructed students on how to think about their bodies, their racial and gender position. How might the interviewer read you, we asked. How do they as students carry their own history to the encounter and into the conversation? How might both of these facts shape the questions asked, but more importantly, the narrative offered? If there is anything this project has taught us, it is that archiving alone is not the answer. We started housing our story with a naive belief that we were going to somehow fix the archive. But archiving with a focus on narrative and a critical race perspective has actually fixed us. Each worker's story has shed light on a different aspect of the university that we were completely oblivious to. We didn't understand the degree to which the story the university tells about itself, which is literally the story of the archive, has functioned as a barrier for others to tell a different story. Each person's narrative has brought us face to face with a new ethical dilemma. What exactly is our responsibility to create the kind of institution that will make people less fearful to share their story, to share their history, to share their experience?
I would be careful about how we use their narratives, because I think it was a big step for a lot of them to share those stories with us, and if any action resulted from any negative actions towards those workers resulted from us interviewing them, that, I think that would completely negate any positive that would come from these interviews.
I love this clip. I love it because the student understands that her actions and our actions have consequences. One has this responsibility to not simply collect, but to narrate, and more importantly, to put into place conditions that invite more and more people to give different narratives. What is the takeaway here? Archives matter, but narrative and the tools to interpret narrative must accompany them. Through the focus on stories, art archiving can do some serious political and economic work. It opens the door to create new data points about wages, about harassment, about lack of transparency. It invites people to see themselves as one of many and not just one. But most importantly, and in the words of one student, it helps to make the abstract into the tangible and to collapse the distance between information and human life. Thank you.